Alright, let's sleep. Pull the blankets up to your nose, kick off your socks, and imagine you're sitting on a riverbank in a damp English meadow, surrounded by angry knights, hungry horses, and a king who looks like he's just swallowed a wasp. The year is 1215, and you are about to witness one of the most important, and most ridiculous, moments in English history. This is the story of the Magna Carta. But it's not just a story about a piece of parchment. It's a story about a king who was so terrible that his own barons decided to stage an intervention. A story about a civil war fought over taxes, castles, and the right to be left alone. A story about a rebellious archbishop, a French prince, and a legendary outlaw who may or may not have been there. So settle in. We're going to start at the beginning, which, as it happens, is with a man who was born to be a villain. Let's meet our protagonist, or rather, our antagonist. His name is John, and he is the King of England. But calling him king is a generous description. He was not tall, not handsome, not brave, and not particularly smart. He was short, red-haired, and had a temper that could curdle milk from across the room. He was the youngest son of the great King Henry II and the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, which meant he grew up in the shadow of his older brothers, all of whom were taller, stronger, and more popular. John was not supposed to be king. The throne was supposed to go to his brother Richard the Lionheart, that same Richard we met in the Crusade story. Richard was a warrior hero, a legend, a man who could crush a lion's heart with his bare hands, or so the stories say. But Richard died childless in 1199, and John, the least favorite brother, inherited the crown. The English people were not thrilled. They had a saying, "Heaven cannot have a devil," so it sent John. That's how popular he was. John's reign was a catalogue of disasters. He lost most of England's possessions in France, the vast territories that his father and brother had conquered. He fought a disastrous war against King Philip II of France and lost Normandy, Anjou, and all the other lovely bits of continental land that had made England a major European power. By 1204, John had nothing left in France except a few scattered castles. The English barons, who had land on both sides of the Channel, were furious. Their ancestral estates were now in enemy hands, and John had done nothing to save them. But John had other talents. He was, if nothing else, an expert at making enemies. He offended the Pope, the Church, his barons, his own wife, and practically everyone else who crossed his path. He taxed his subjects mercilessly, inventing new taxes whenever he needed cash, which was always. He fined people for imaginary crimes, confiscated estates, and demanded scutage, a tax paid in lieu of military service, so often that the barons joked that John would tax their farts if he could find a way. John was also famously suspicious and vindictive. He had a habit of imprisoning his enemies, and sometimes his friends, in his castles, where they were left to rot. He starved one baron to death in a dungeon for refusing to pay a tax. He murdered his own nephew, Arthur of Brittany, a rival claimant to the throne, and he did it with his own hands, according to some chronicles, by throwing him off a castle wall. Whether true or not, the story stuck. People believed John was capable of anything. And on top of all that, John had a terrible relationship with the church. In 1207, he argued with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. John refused to accept the Pope's choice, so the Pope excommunicated him, which meant John was banned from the sacraments and officially a sinner in the eyes of God. Not that John cared. He confiscated church lands, taxed monasteries, and generally acted as if the Pope was just another inconvenient relative. The Pope then placed England under an interdict, a ban on all church services. For 6 years, no bells rang, no marriages were performed, and no dead bodies were buried in consecrated ground. The English people, who were deeply religious, were horrified. They blamed John. Their souls were in danger, and their king was the cause. Finally, John gave in. In 1213, he surrendered to the Pope, accepted the Pope's choice of archbishop, and agreed to pay a huge annual tribute to Rome. It was a humiliating climb down, and it made John look even weaker. The final straw came in 1214. John, desperate to recover his lost French territories, launched a campaign across the Channel. He had assembled a huge army, funded by even more taxes, and he was determined to defeat King Philip of France and reclaim Normandy. It was a catastrophe. John's allies were defeated at the Battle of Bouvines on July 27, 1214, one of the most decisive battles of the medieval period. John himself fled the field, abandoned his baggage train, and returned to England with nothing to show for his efforts except a bruised ego and an empty treasury. The barons had had enough. They had paid for John's wars, they had given him their men and their money, and now they had nothing. John had promised them victory and delivered defeat. He had promised them peace and delivered more taxes. He had promised them justice and delivered tyranny. So they decided to do something about it. The barons of England were not a united group. They were fierce, independent, and often fought each other. But John had a gift for uniting people, against himself. By the spring of 1215, nearly every major baron in the land had turned against him. They gathered secretly, swore oaths of alliance, and prepared to confront the king. Their leader was a man named Robert Fitzwalter, a powerful baron with a personal grudge against John. John had, allegedly, made improper advances on Robert's daughter. Robert declared himself Marshal of the Army of God and Holy Church, which was a fancy way of saying he was leading the rebellion. On the surface, the barons were demanding a return to the laws and liberties of the old days, the days of Edward the Confessor, or Henry I, when kings were supposed to consult their nobles before imposing new taxes. But really, they wanted lower taxes, the return of their ancestral lands, and the assurance that John would stop imprisoning them arbitrarily. In May 1215, the barons formally renounced their allegiance to John. They marched on London, which opened its gates to them. The citizens of London hated John even more than the barons did. John was trapped in Windsor Castle, and his support had melted away. He had no money, no army, and no friends. John had no choice but to negotiate. The meeting took place at a meadow called Runnymede, on the banks of the River Thames, about halfway between London and Windsor. It was a flat, damp, unremarkable piece of land, but it would become the most famous meadow in English history. John arrived with a small retinue of loyal knights. The barons arrived with an army, about 2,000 heavily armed men, just in case the king got any ideas about fighting. The atmosphere was tense. Both sides knew that this was a moment of reckoning. The barons presented John with a document, a charter, that listed their demands. It was written in Latin, as was proper, and it contained 63 clauses, covering everything from inheritance rights to fishing weirs. Some clauses were sensible, some were petty, and a few were utterly bizarre. For example, Clause 1 stated that the Church of England would be free from royal interference, a victory for the Pope and the Archbishop. Clause 12 said that the king could not levy certain taxes without the consent of the Common Council of the kingdom, a vague phrase that the barons interpreted as, "we have to agree." Clause 39 was the most famous. It said that no free man could be imprisoned, disseized, or exiled except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. This is the clause that later lawyers would hail as the foundation of trial by jury. But there were also clauses about fish weirs. The barons complained that John had built too many weirs in the rivers, preventing fish from swimming upstream. And there was a clause about widows, they would not be forced to remarry if they didn't want to. And a clause about merchants, they could travel freely, as long as they paid the proper tolls. John read through the clauses. He must have been furious. His father and brother had ruled with iron fists, and here he was, forced to accept the demands of his own subjects. But he had no choice. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned. On June 15, 1215, John placed his royal seal on the document, not a signature, because he probably couldn't write very well, but a wax seal with his image. The barons cheered. The Archbishop, Stephen Langton, gave a blessing. The meadow was full of hopeful faces. But John was not a man to give up so easily. He had sealed the charter, but in his mind, it was just a piece of parchment. He had no intention of keeping his promises. As soon as the barons dispersed, John began plotting his revenge. He wrote to the Pope, his new friend, now that he had accepted the Pope's authority, and asked him to annul the charter. The Pope was more than happy to oblige. He issued a papal bull declaring Magna Carta null and void of all validity forever. He even excommunicated the rebel barons. John raised a new army, this time with mercenaries from the continent. He hired thousands of Flemish, German, and French soldiers, and he began a brutal campaign against the barons, burning their castles, seizing their lands, and executing their followers. The war, known as the First Barons' War, was cruel and destructive. The barons, desperate, turned to an unlikely ally, Prince Louis of France, the son of King Philip II. They invited Louis to come to England and take the throne, which was, to put it mildly, a massive betrayal of their own king. But John had betrayed them first, so they felt justified. Louis landed in England in May 1216 with a French army. He marched on London, where the barons and the citizens welcomed him as their new ruler. Louis was crowned, though not officially king, and he controlled most of eastern and southern England. John was on the run. His mercenaries were deserting, his castles were falling, and his health was failing. In October 1216, while crossing the Wash, a bay on the east coast of England, John lost his entire baggage train. The wagons, carrying his crown jewels, his silver plate, and his precious treasure, were swallowed by quicksand and the incoming tide. It was a catastrophic loss, both financially and symbolically. John fell ill shortly afterwards, probably from dysentery, the medieval soldier's curse. He died on the night of October 19, 1216, in Newark Castle. According to one chronicler, he died for the love of a pear, after eating too many that day. Whether true or not, he died in agony, raving mad, cursing his enemies. His 9-year-old son, Henry, was hastily crowned King Henry III at Gloucester. The Regency Council, led by William Marshal, the greatest knight of the age, quickly reissued Magna Carta, but with some clauses removed, to win over the barons and end the war. The war eventually fizzled out. Louis was defeated and sent back to France. The barons made peace with Henry, and Magna Carta was reissued again in 1217 and 1225. For most of the Middle Ages, Magna Carta was not considered a sacred document. It was just a peace treaty that had failed to keep the peace. It was largely forgotten, except by lawyers who occasionally cited it in court cases. But in the 17th century, during the English Civil War, Parliament rediscovered Magna Carta and used it as a weapon against the king. They argued that the king was subject to the law, just like everyone else. This idea was taken up by the American colonists, who cited Magna Carta in their complaints against the British Crown. Today, Magna Carta is considered one of the founding documents of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Clauses 39 and 40, no free man shall be arrested or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his peers, are echoed in the American Bill of Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the constitutions of many countries. But we should not be too reverent. The original Magna Carta was not a democratic document. It was a baronial power grab. It protected the rights of wealthy nobles, not ordinary peasants. The barons who forced John to sign it were not fighting for freedom, they were fighting for lower taxes. They had no interest in giving women, serfs, or merchants a voice. Nevertheless, the idea that a king could be bound by law was revolutionary. For centuries, European kings had claimed absolute power. John's signature on that parchment was the first time a medieval monarch had officially acknowledged that his will was not the only law. Let's take a moment to remember the people who made this story happen. King John, a villain in every sense, but also a deeply human figure. He was insecure, greedy, and paranoid. He had a habit of twitching and biting his nails. He slept poorly. He trusted no one. His reign was a disaster, but he was also a product of his upbringing, the youngest son, always overshadowed, always fighting for attention. Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was the unsung hero of Magna Carta. He was a scholar, a churchman, and a man of principle. He had been chosen by the Pope, but he worked tirelessly to broker peace between John and the barons. He wrote the first draft of Magna Carta, and he ensured that it had religious legitimacy. Without him, the charter might never have been sealed. The barons, a motley crew of 25 men who were named as the guardians of the charter. They included Robert Fitzwalter, Eustace de Vesey, and William d'Aubigny. They were brave, stubborn, and often self-serving. But they also showed remarkable courage in defying their king. They knew they risked death, and some of them lost their lives in the subsequent war. William Marshal, the knight who saved the monarchy. He was in his 70s when the war broke out, but he was the most respected man in England. He had served 5 kings, fought in hundreds of battles, and never broken his word. He became regent for the young Henry III, and his integrity and wisdom kept the kingdom together. He reissued Magna Carta and made it stick. Prince Louis, the French prince who almost became King of England. He was a capable commander, and he came close to winning the war. But he was outmaneuvered by William Marshal, and he eventually gave up. He went back to France and later became King Louis VIII. And then there is the legendary figure of Robin Hood, the outlaw who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. It is almost certain that Robin Hood never existed, or if he did, he lived in an earlier century. But the legend of Robin Hood is forever associated with the reign of King John, because John was the perfect villain for Robin to oppose. In some versions of the story, Robin Hood fights alongside the barons at Runnymede. It's not true, but it's a lovely idea. Let's not forget the humor. The story of Magna Carta is full of absurd moments. First, there is the king himself. John was not a majestic king, he was a petulant child who threw tantrums when he didn't get his way. He once threw away his crown in a fury and had to be persuaded to pick it up. He was so unpopular that his own mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, begged his brother Richard to disinherit him. He was the kind of man who would tax a dead bishop's estate, which he did, often. Then there is the charter itself. The barons wrote 63 clauses, but they couldn't agree on which ones were most important. They argued over fish weirs. They argued over widows. They argued over the rights of foreign merchants. They argued so much that the final document was a messy compromise, like a group project that no one really liked. And there is the sealing process. John didn't sign the document, he attached his royal seal. But the seal was so large and heavy that it took 2 men to carry it. And when John pressed it into the wax cracked, making the seal imperfect. For centuries, historians have debated whether that was a sign of John's disrespect, or just a clumsy accident. Another absurdity, after John sealed Magna Carta, he immediately sent a copy to the Pope, asking him to annul it. The Pope obliged, and John then ignored the charter. But his own men had sworn to enforce it. So the king was fighting against his own promise. And the final irony, John died before the war was over, and Henry III reissued the charter to buy peace. So the king who fought against Magna Carta was succeeded by a king who embraced it, because it was politically convenient. Magna Carta did not create democracy overnight. In fact, for centuries, it was just a footnote in history. But the idea that the king was subject to the law, that there was a higher authority than the monarch, slowly gained traction. In 1297, Edward I confirmed Magna Carta as part of English law, and it became a fixed part of the legal system. During the Tudor period, the monarchs ignored it, but in the 17th century, it was revived by parliamentarians who wanted to limit royal power. In 1628, Sir Edward Coke, a great lawyer, used Magna Carta to argue that the king could not imprison people without trial. In 1679, it was cited in the Habeas Corpus Act, which protected citizens from unlawful detention. In 1689, it was echoed in the Bill of Rights. The American colonists read Magna Carta and saw in it their own rights, to trial by jury, to no taxation without representation, to due process of law. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison quoted it. The U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights are, in many ways, descendants of that grubby piece of parchment. Today, 3 copies of the 1215 Magna Carta survive, one in Lincoln Cathedral, one in Salisbury Cathedral, and one in the British Library. They are kept in climate-controlled cases, protected from light and humidity. They look old and faded, but their words still have power. So, my sleepy friend, what do we take away from this story of a bad king, angry barons, and a meadow full of mud? First, no one is above the law. Not kings, not presidents, not prime ministers. John thought he could do whatever he wanted, but his own subjects eventually called him to account. The law is a shield and a sword, it protects us from tyranny, and it gives us a way to fight back. Second, compromise is possible, even when you hate each other. John and the barons loathed each other, but they managed to sit down and write a document. It didn't last, but it set a precedent. In our own lives, we can learn to negotiate with our enemies, not because we love them, but because it's better than fighting. Third, words matter. A few sentences on a piece of parchment changed the course of history. The phrase, "No free man shall be arrested or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his peers," that was just a legal formula at the time, but it became a rallying cry for millions. Never underestimate the power of writing things down. Fourth, the past is messy. Magna Carta was not a pure, noble document. It was a political compromise, full of holes and contradictions. The barons who forced it on John were not heroes, they were rich men protecting their own interests. But sometimes, imperfect actions lead to better outcomes. We should not expect perfection from history, we should appreciate the small steps forward. And finally, the human capacity for change is remarkable. John was a tyrant, but his reign led to a document that curbed tyranny. The barons rebelled for selfish reasons, but their rebellion laid the groundwork for democracy. Out of chaos and greed came something good. That's not a bad lesson for anyone. Now, close your eyes. Imagine you are sitting in the grass at Runnymede, on a cool June day. The river flows lazily past. The king's tent is pitched on one side, the barons' pavilions on the other. The air smells of horses, sweat, and hope. You watch as the king's chancellor brings out the parchment. The barons crowd around, their fingers itching to grasp the seal. John mutters something under his breath, probably a curse, but he presses the seal into the wax. The deed is done. The barons cheer. A few of them weep. The archbishop raises his hand in blessing. And for a brief moment, everyone believes that peace has come. Of course, it hasn't. War will erupt again. John will die, the kingdom will be divided, and the charter will be rewritten. But the idea that a king can be bound by law, will survive. Centuries later, people will look back at that moment and see the birth of liberty. They will see a king who was forced to kneel to his own nobles. They will see the first crack in the absolute power of monarchy. They will see a document that, however flawed, changed the world. And you, my listener, have been there. You've seen it all. Now you can drift off to sleep, knowing that even the most powerful rulers can be brought to the table. That even the most stubborn conflicts can lead to something good. That even the worst kings can leave a legacy, sometimes by accident. So sleep well. Sleep deeply. And may your dreams be free of taxes, weirs, and excommunicated kings. Good night.